Thank you very much. Allow me to say just a few words because this event was only possible with the fantastic cooperation mit Resi, der Rote Börsenkrach, die Gesellschaft Plurale Ökonomik in Wien und die Mastervertretung Volkswirtschaft an der WU Wien. Ich danke euch ganz, ganz herzlich für diese Zusammenarbeit. Es war fantastisch, großartig. And I thank all the... I thank all the people from the media who are here. We are very happy that you're interested in what we are doing. The Bruno Kreisky Forum has, as Yanis said tonight, a long-standing relationship with Yanis Varoufakis, and we are hoping to go on working together for a better future. Thank you very much, Yanis, for coming. Thank you. Thank you.
I was asked to say some words on behalf of the co-organizers of tonight's event, the Society of Pluralism in Economics, and that's right, the Rote Börsenkrach, the current and traditional student representatives of economics at the Uni Wien, and the Student Council of Economics at the WU. And I promise to keep it short because I know no one's here to listen to me talk, but to hear Yanis talk, and that's why I'm here. So all I want to say that there are very many reasons why all of you are here, so I'm not going to list them. I'm going to tell you why we're here, and with we I mean my colleagues. Number one, as advocates for pluralism in economics, we were more than eager to have you here, of course. Number two, in the recent Viennese elections, a third of the population voted for the right-wing populist party. And arguably, many of these voters are simply looking for an alternative to the status quo. And evidently, we need to be able to offer them other alternatives. And luckily, there are such alternatives. And we know that you proposed those, so we're happy to have you those for there. And number three, finally, as economists and economic students, hearing about the apparent disregard of Yanis's economic arguments in the Eurogroup, well, we were less than amused, and we wonder if economic knowledge has no place in politics, then what's the point of studying economics? Did we choose the wrong profession? So we hope to hear answers to all of these questions and more so, and we're very curious, excited to hear Robert and Yanis later. So on behalf of everyone, welcome Yanis to Vienna. Thank you.
University of Vienna, thank you so much. Thank you to the Kreisky Forum, in particular to the Society for Economic Pluralism. I spent all my life, this is my natural habitat, by the way, a university and also a society which promotes economic pluralism. Because let's face it, one of the reasons why in 2008 global capitalism collapsed was because our societies, and in particular our leaders, had lost the capacity to subject their economic thinking to pluralist criticism. That, I called it an econobubble that burst. The idea that you can model the world on the basis of a mathematical model featuring a single person, a Robinson Crusoe, who was his own employer, and therefore there could be no unemployment. And if there was unemployment, there was something wrong with the legislation, and trades unions were to blame. This econobubble burst at the same time as the financialization bubble burst. And the Euro crisis, which I suppose I'm going to be speaking about today, was a result of the inability of the architecture of the monetary union to sustain that bursting of the bubble that began in Wall Street and then very quickly moved to Europe, managing to usurp our political process by means of an ideology that was based on the lack of economic pluralism. So what you folks are doing here is very dear to my heart, and I think it's a very central part of the conundrum that we are facing in Europe today. As an academic who happened to turn politician almost accidentally, allow me to introduce what I have to say today in the form of an anecdote. I was in Brussels, I remember, sometime in February, and I was speaking to a quite high-ranking Austrian national who is also a person of importance and power in the corridors of power in Europe. And at some point he said to me, "You realize, Yanis, that the young people of Austria are only interested in one question." And I said, "What is that question?" "Will they get their money back from Greece?" Now, I hope you're not here for this purpose. Indeed, the fact that you're here confirms my suspicion that he was completely misguided as to what the young Austrians are concerned with. Moving to another anecdote, I believe that Mahatma Gandhi once was asked what he thought about European civilization. And that thought came to me, that memory of that quotation came to me in Brussels, watching in action our Eurocrats, the Eurogroup, the European Council, our politicians. And Gandhi's response to the question of what he thought about European civilization came back to me. Do you remember what he answered? He said, "It would be a great idea." Similarly, with the European Union, when you are inside those buildings and you watch the unfolding discussions and debates and shenanigans and political, or bureaucratic, I should say, processes, it's very easy to be lulled into a false sense that you belong to a European Union. Indeed, it would be great to have a European Union. It would be a splendid idea. But we don't have one. We have processes and we have institutions that, at least in my estimation, and I will say a few more things about this tonight, are presiding over a process of fragmentation, of divergence, of deconstruction of our union. And the reason why there is so much uncertainty and so much fear, which then manifests itself in a variety of nasty ways and in a variety of failures throughout the continent, is due to this underlying process of disintegration that began once our monetary union was hit by the maelstrom which originated in Wall Street. This is not the first time this happens to Europe. In 1929, Wall Street collapsed and the common currency of that era began to unravel. It was the gold standard. One proud nation turned against another. Sometimes proud nations turned against themselves. And we know what happened towards the end of the 1930s. In 2008, our generation's 1929 hit, and the common currency of our era, which was designed, by the way, along the lines of the gold standard of the 1920s, as if we're a bit like the Bourbons. We forget nothing and learn nothing. This disintegration that began after 2008 has begun a process of turning one proud nation against another. The Greeks dislike the Germans dislike the Greeks, everybody dislikes the French. The British want to get out. The Irish are worried that if the British get out, what are they going to do? So we have a process of disintegration. But there are good reasons why that is, and there are excellent reasons why we need to stop this process. Allow me to juxtapose, to compare and contrast two narratives, two stories. One is the official story as to the essence of the Euro crisis. And it goes something like this. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but let me just restate it for the record once more. We created the Eurozone along the lines of very specific rules. The Maastricht Treaty, if you recall. Rules that govern the levels that are considered to be maxima concerning budget deficits for member states, concerning debt to GDP ratios, rules that constrain the functioning of the European Central Bank, the Charter of the ECB, the no bailout clause. It was a rules-based monetary union of sovereign member states. And the dominant story is that people and governments did not play by the rules. There was a violation of these rules. There was a kind of free-rider logic. You assume that everybody else will respect the rules. You don't have to respect them yourself if everybody does their duty and respects them. Deficits and debts build up. There is profligacy. Some countries live beyond their means. Then those bubbles burst, especially as a result of a financial sector collapse that emanated from Wall Street. And then Europe started paying the price of the rule violations of the previous years, the period before 2008. And it found itself in a situation where it had to create new institutions and to reinterpret the rules, add to those rules new rules like the fiscal pact, the six-pack, the two-pack, and so on, in order to bring Europe back to the rules that it had agreed to during Maastricht. And if we stick to our guns and remain disciplined, we will see this crisis through. We have to build resilience through belt tightening, because you cannot cure debt problems, bankruptcy with more debt, and that the countries that elect governments like ours that are recalcitrant and they demand the right to violate the rules have to be reined in. And the fact that you can have a democratically elected government in Greece which challenges those rules doesn't mean anything, because there are another 18 countries that have their own democratic mandate, and one country's democratic mandate cannot counter and overcome the mandate of the rest. Austerity was the only alternative according to this narrative. It had to be introduced. The banks had to be bailed out. The no bailout clause had to be violated, but in a way that minimizes the degree of rewards afforded to those who broke the rules. And also, we have, as part of this narrative, a certain tendency for celebrating the success of this program. Ireland, Portugal, Spain are hailed as success stories. And in this context, the fact that the democratically elected government of Greece, to which I was a member, was crushed in June, July, is considered to be a price worth paying in order to preserve the solidity of the Eurozone and the righteousness of everybody else who played by the rules. This is one narrative. I think that you're familiar with this. We read stories and we hear political speeches, especially east of the Rhine and north of the Alps, which are predicated upon this version of the story. And allow me as a Greek to say that there is a Greek that bears significant responsibility for this narrative. His name was Aesop. He's to blame. Because with his parable of the ants and the grasshoppers, he created a story tale by which the terrible grasshoppers who basked in the sun and had fun during the good times find their comeuppance when the winter comes, and when they knock on the door of the industrious ants who've been working all summer to save up for the rainy day, And those ants may offer the dying grasshoppers in the middle of winter some of their accumulated stock of food, but they will only do under very stringent conditions. The notion that all the ants of Europe live in the north and all the grasshoppers have congregated in the south and in Ireland would be quaint if it were not so catastrophic. So let's blame a Greek, and I choose Aesop to be the one we blame. The reality, of course, is quite different. There are ants and there are grasshoppers in every one of our member states in the Eurozone. So allow me now to recalibrate the Aesop story in the context of the second narrative. Not the official one, but the one that I want to communicate with you. In 2000, we created, as I mentioned before, or actually we recreated the gold standard in the heart of Europe. We created a fixed exchange rate regime that was extremely tightly knit because we gave up our currencies. It's not just that we fixed exchange rates. We fixed them in a way that was more or less irreversible by doing away with these currencies and replacing them with the euro. But we forgot to add to this monetary union the shock absorbers which are necessary in order to do two things. Firstly, to prevent shocks from coming, and secondly, from absorbing them when they come. Instead, we removed shock absorbers from Central Europe and ensured that when the shock would come, it would be maximal. Let me be a bit more specific about this. Take Germany and take Italy, or let's take Germany and Greece, because these are the extreme cases that resonate in people's minds. Greece always had a deficit, trade deficit vis-à-vis Germany. Always did, always will. In the same way that East Germany has a trade deficit vis-à-vis West Germany, that London has a trade surplus vis-à-vis Yorkshire and Wales, and always will. Yeah? This is what happens within Austria. There are deficit parts of Austria and surplus parts of Austria. Within Vienna, there are deficit and there are surplus suburbs of Vienna. This is what happens when you have a macroeconomy. There are deficit and surplus parts. When two different economies and political economies are bound together through trade, but they still retain their currencies, the deficit country's currency constantly devalues, and that is a shock absorber that effectively puts the brakes on the expansion of the trade imbalance between the two, because imports into the deficit country become more expensive and its exports to the surplus country become cheaper. So every time the Italian lira devalued, Fiat restored some of their competitiveness vis-à-vis Volkswagen. Oops. I shouldn't have said that word. I won't mention diesel engines. Now, when you lock those currencies together, and when you replace them with a single currency, effectively the Deutschmark, now what happens then? The deficit-surplus relationship is maintained. Still, the deficit country will have a deficit vis-à-vis the surplus country. But the cash that moves from the deficit to the surplus country, every time an Italian buys a Volkswagen goes to Italy from Germany, and the bundle of cash goes from Italy to a German bank account, usually somewhere in Frankfurt. Eh? So a mountain of capital that is amassing in the financial center of the surplus country is by definition the other side of the current account surplus that that country has vis-à-vis the deficit country. Now, what does a banker fear most? Idle cash. Money that is sitting there in the bank, not being lent. That is the worst nightmare for a banker, to have money that he or she is not lending out. Now, when there is this mountain of money, or if you want a lake of idle cash in Germany, in Frankfurt, due to the fact that Germany has a large current account surplus vis-à-vis Spain, Greece, Italy, there is a tendency for the German banker to want to lend it to the deficit country. Why? Because there is an oversupply of cash, of money, in the surplus country. So the price of money in Germany is very low. What's the price of money? It's the nominal interest rate, the yields. And because there is a dearth of capital in the deficit country, because it has flown to the surplus country, the price of money there, the interest rate there is high. So there is an interest rate differential. Interest rates are, by definition, much higher in the deficit countries than in the surplus countries. So the banker in the surplus country has an incentive. It's his job. That's his job. I mean, if they don't do that, they are in dereliction of their duties to their shareholders. It's their objective, therefore, and duty to take that money and lend it to the deficit country. Now, when the deficit country has its own currency, the banker in the surplus country thinks twice about it. Because if there is a danger of devaluation in the deficit country, you fear that you give this money to the deficit country, it will devalue. And then it will be hard for the debtor in the deficit country to repay you. But if you have a fixed exchange rate, that fear goes away. You think, oh, lending to Athens is the same thing as lending to Stuttgart. It's the same currency. There will be no devaluation. So what happens when you bind together disparate economies monetarily without introducing any other form of recycling surpluses and deficits is that there is a tsunami of capital from the surplus to the deficit countries. It is absolutely impossible to avoid that. In the history of capitalism, we've seen this every time. When the gold standard was created in the 1920s, and fixed exchange rates became the norm, this is what happened. When Argentina pegged its currency to the US dollar, there was a tsunami of capital from the United States to Argentina. Same with Mexico. Same in the Eurozone, of course. So what happens, however, is this. Surplus money, capital from the surplus countries comes to the deficit countries. The deficit countries are, by definition, this is why they're deficit countries, at a stage of lower development of their industry. So they have lower price-cost margins. They are less competitive by definition. So the capital that flows into places like Spain and Greece goes into what? Into creating bubbles in real estate, in Spain, in Ireland, in Greece. It went into the state borrowed that money and gave it to the developers. But aggregate debt, total debt, goes up. And this is the natural repercussion of having trade imbalances within a monetary union. We should have known that. Well, actually, we did know that. We can have a discussion later, and also in the Q&A, as to who knew and what they knew, and what evidence is there of what they knew and who knew. But I'll leave this for later. Now, the moment you have, in the deficit countries, bubbles being created in the housing market, for instance, you know that the moment the banks have a problem and they find it very hard to lend to one another and they start fearing that they will lose their money, they will simply stop refinancing these loans which sustain those bubbles. This is what happened in 2008. In 2008, the financial sector collapsed for its own reasons, beginning in Wall Street. Suddenly, Deutsche Bank stopped lending to the Spanish, to the Greeks, to the Irish. But those bubbles that were sustaining the high growth rates in the deficit countries were debt-fueled. So if you switch off the liquidity from the German banks, these bubbles burst. When they burst, construction workers lose their job. That creates a chain reaction throughout the deficit country, Spain, Greece, Ireland, and so on and so forth. And suddenly, those debts to the German bank become unpayable because the incomes from which they have to be repaid shrink, and there's no refinancing. It's a typical case of bubbles that burst, and the burden of adjustment falls on the deficit regions. Now, when this happens, there are two things that we can do. One is to pretend that it didn't happen, to pretend that there is no bankruptcy problem. Rogue bankers, bankers that are themselves insolvent and they do not want to reveal that they are bankrupt, when they have lent to many developers and those loans have gone bad, they will never admit to it. Because if they, what does it mean to admit to it? To write down those debts, to take their books, and where in the asset column to say, well, Hans owes me 100 million, but Hans has gone bankrupt, so I'm writing it off. If you keep doing this, which is the right thing to do, then at some point the ECB or the Central Bank of Austria will come in and will look at your books and say, you're insolvent, and take you over. And you either resolve your bank or recapitalize it with state money, but you as a shareholder, you lose your control of the bank. So if you're a rogue banker, what you have a tendency to do is to extend and pretend. Are you familiar with the concept of extending and pretending? So what you do is you say to France, I know that you're bankrupt, but let's pretend you're not. So I'm going to give you another 50 million, from which you are going to be pretending to be making the repayments to me, so that I don't write off your loan. Because if I do, then I lose my bank. What do you think? He likes this idea. He's bankrupt, he gets a lease of life. You never know. In 3 months' time, he may win the lotto or something. Or there may be a miracle. That's what rogue bankers do. This is what we did in the Eurozone. When the bubbles burst in the periphery, beginning with Greece, what happened in May 2010? The most bankrupt state in the Eurozone, which is Greece, we could not refinance our public debt. We were given the largest loan ever in human history in order to pretend and extend, to pretend that we are meeting our repayments, extending the crisis into the future. But actually, it's worse than that. With France, the rogue banker would never think of saying to him, you know, France, I'm going to give you an extend and pretend loan on condition that you shrink your income. You would never do that. This would be completely irrational and mind-boggling. Yeah? But this is what they did with Greece. The 110 billion that was lent to Greece in May 2010 came with austerity strings attached, which with mathematical precision would shrink Greek national income massively. In the end, it was more than a quarter. More than a quarter. So, can you believe that? It's like me saying to you, I know you can't repay your credit card loan, so I'll give you another credit card from which to draw money to pay the first credit card on condition that you shrink your income. If I were to say this, you would think that I'm completely nuts, and you would have me interned into some lunatic facility. But this is what happened with Greece. Now, nobody's inane. Nobody did this because they didn't understand why they were doing it. The only reason why it happened was because the Bundestag had approved 500 billion of a bailout for the German banks a year before. And the German federal government was not up to it politically to go back to the Bundestag and say, listen, folks, I know we've just given Frankfurt 500 billion, but now the Greeks are going under, and they owe a lot of money to the Frankfurt banks and to the French banks, and the French banks owe to the German banks. So, if we allow Greece to default, then we, the Bundestag, will have to give another large loan to the banks. The first time Chancellor Merkel went to the Bundestag to secure that 500 billion for the banks, it was political poison for her. She couldn't do it again. So, instead, she went to them and said, the grasshoppers of the south, Greeks, overspent, they violated the rules, and now we have to save them. We don't like doing it, but for the purposes of preserving the Eurozone and European solidarity, we'll give them 110 billion. A bailout for Greece. It was not a bailout for Greece. It was a bailout for Deutsche Bank, Finanzbank, BNP Paribas, Société Générale. 90% of that money went to those banks. Do you know what proportion of the latest bailout, the one which I didn't sign in July, the reason for me being here as a former finance minister is I didn't sign that. Of that 85 billion, the third loan, do you know how much will go to the Greek state? It's a radical number, 0. Yeah? So when we talk about bailouts, we should be analytical about exactly what we're referring to as the subject of the bailout. Who is being bailed out? In May 2008, it was clearly the banks of Northern Europe. What should have happened, the alternative, would have been to allow the Greek state to default. If you're bankrupt, you shouldn't borrow more money until you stop being bankrupt. Is this a very radical left-wing concept? I don't think so. I think that any sensible person, especially a right-wing conservative person, would agree with this. So this is, how I became politically active. In Europe, we've reached the stage where you have to be a radical left-winger in order to put forward very conservative, common sense proposals. Consider that. And everybody else is extending and pretending. Do you think anyone believes that the third bailout program that I didn't sign in this last summer is going to have any chance of being sustainable in Brussels or in Frankfurt? No. And how do I know that? Because they tell me so. So why are they doing it? It's extending and pretending, while at the same time celebrating the end of a crisis. So, to put it very bluntly, before 2008, we had fake growth in the periphery. Fake growth. In American terms, Ponzi growth, a pyramidic scheme with debt-fueled, unsustainable debt, creating bubbles which gave a semblance of growth. And you had Greece growing at 5% when Germany was struggling to reach 1% of growth. And after the bubbles burst, we had Ponzi or fake austerity. Because there's nothing austere about borrowing hundreds of billions. In my mind, austerity is about belt tightening and doing with less. But Greece has borrowed more money than any country in the whole world. Where is the austerity in this? Where is the belt tightening? We had debt-fueled, unsustainable debt-fueled growth before 2008, and we have unsustainable debt-fueled austerity now, which is creating a humanitarian crisis that is poisoning the political scene, turning one nation against the other. Greece should not be important to you. To me, it will always be important because it's my country, it's my home. But it's only a pipsqueak little place. 2% of Eurozone GDP. Why is it constantly in the news for 5 years now? If the great state of Delaware was capable of causing a crisis of the United States for 5 years, permit me to suggest to you that that would be a problem of the United States, not of the state of Delaware. If Greece maintains its position as the battleground of the Eurozone, and constantly undermining the solidity of the Eurozone, allow me to suggest again that that simply indicates that there is something wrong with the Eurozone, with the way we constructed it. In the old times, down deep mines in Belgium, here in Germany, in the Ruhr, in Britain, miners used to carry with them a small cage with a canary, and they would hang it there. And it was a harbinger of terrible things to come. The purpose of the canary, because it had a weaker constitution than the miners, was to die when the methane gas flowed as an early warning system that methane is happening. The canary was not responsible for the disaster. It was an early warning system. Greece is the canary of the Eurozone. We fell on our face first because we were the flimsiest social economy in the Eurozone, but the reason why we were capable, in spite of being a little canary, to spark off this domino effect and to remain a subject of conversation and headlines, this simply reflects the problems with the architecture of the Eurozone. If you look at the history of the dollar zone, also known as the United States of America, you will see that in the last 200 years, it too began as a flimsy union. The United States initially was a kind of confederacy. It did not have the institutions that it has today. The American president, George Washington, and the others that followed him, had very little power. They had a very small budget. Even all the way up to 1932, there was a danger of the dollar zone breaking up. But the profound difference between Europe and the United States of America, our union and their union, is that every time they had a crisis, every time they had a financial scare, every time they had an implosion, a debt crisis, a banking crisis, they got closer together. They created institutions that bonded the different states and the American people closer together. They had a civil war too, and that was also a bonding exercise, like family feuds usually are, one hopes. Look at the way that the Fed was created. It was created in the first decade of the 20th century as a result of a financial crisis. JP Morgan said, I've had enough of bailing out other smaller bankers. Let's have a state central bank doing this job. But still, it did not have the instruments that were necessary to solidify the United States of America. It took 1929 and the great crash then to bring about the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt with the FDIC, which brought about a proper banking union, a system for resolving banks, for supervising them, which is continental-wide. It brought about Social Security and a degree of a welfare state, especially for the elderly, that created transfers between the deficit and the surplus states, and the war, which brought about the military-industrial complex, which is the greatest investment bank in the world. When Boeing gets a contract from the Pentagon to build a fighter jet, it also receives friendly advice, which is whispered into the ear of the CEO of Boeing from the Pentagon, who said, if you really want this contract, you need to build from scratch a new facility, a new production base in Tennessee, Missouri, Mississippi, to build the engines or the wings of the new plane. That is deficit states, where investment is needed to create the jobs that generate the incomes that allow those deficits to be repaid and allow the Tennessee residents and the Missouri residents to buy goods and services from California and from New York State, which are surplus states, so that those surplus states can see their surplus being reproduced. This is not philanthropy towards Mississippi and Missouri. It's pragmatism. It is the only way of making a monetary union work. Did we do any of this when we created the Eurozone? No. Imagine that the dollar zone was structured the way that the Eurozone is ruled over in 2008. And let's compare and contrast two jurisdictions, Ireland and the great state of Nevada. The weather is very different, the people are very different, but the population is similar, about 3 million. And the economies are pretty similar too, in the sense that they rely on a great deal of real estate, financial services, as well as low corporate tax. That's the parallelism. Now, in 2008, if the United States of America were governed by the rules of the Eurozone, this is what would have happened. The implosion of the banking system and of the housing market would mean that the developers, the builders, the construction workers of the state of Nevada would be either bankrupt or unemployed, depending on whether they're employers or workers. The banks would be insolvent. And the state government of Nevada would have to go to the international markets, cap in hand, seeking loans to bail out their banks and to pay their unemployment benefits without the help of the Fed. In exactly the same way that Ireland had to do without the Fed of the ECB, Greece had to do without the help of the ECB. But of course, international investors, during a crisis, they stop lending. They go on a lending strike. So the great state of Nevada would be bankrupt. They would have to go to Washington, D.C. and beg for a bailout loan. Imagine if Washington, D.C. were to say to the state of Nevada, we'll give you a very large bailout loan, but on condition that you cut wages, you cut pensions, you cut everything. You close down museums, you reduce expenditure on health and education. And the state of Nevada government accepts that. But immediately that means that the state income of Nevada would shrink and it would go deeper into the hole of bankruptcy. And what do you think would happen next? Well, that's a rhetorical question, I'll tell you. The next thing is that Missouri would fall on the same sword. and then Mississippi, and then Arizona. And then eventually the crisis would hit California and the state of New York. The reason why the United States is recovering is because they were not structured that way. They were not structured like the Eurozone. In the Eurozone, going back to the official narrative, somebody from Brussels standing here would say, yes, but Mr. Varoufakis, you are ignoring the fact that we consolidated too. We, like the Americans, after a financial crisis, created new institutions. And indeed we did. We created the European Stability Mechanism. We created the Banking Union. We created it, well, we didn't create, Mario Draghi conjured up quantitative easing. These are all great departures from the original design of the Eurozone. But let me, ladies and gentlemen, antagonize my friends and colleagues in Brussels and Frankfurt by saying that these were efforts to restructure the Eurozone in name but not in substance. Let's take them one by one. The European Stability Mechanism should be called the European Instability Mechanism. What does it do? It lends to basket case countries like Greece and Portugal and so on, and Spain, by borrowing itself on behalf of the rest of the Eurozone. How does it borrow? It issues bonds, ESM bonds. It used to be EFSF bonds. The EFSF graduated, became the ESM. Now, those bonds are structured like the CDOs of Lehman Brothers. They contain different compartments. One part of the bond is guaranteed by the German state, another by the Austrian state, another by the French state, another by the Slovak state. Each one of these parts of each bond comes with a different interest rate and a different probability of default. This was exactly the structured derivatives that Wall Street created, which imploded in 2008. Now, the problem with this is that this bond that I just described contains the domino effect within it. Because if you are the marginal state, the state that has not just quite gone bankrupt, but may do so soon. So think of Ireland in September of 2010. Greece had already fallen. Ireland was teetering. It was about to fall. But Ireland had to borrow on behalf of Greece, to lend to Greece. So its interest rates went up, it fell. Portugal, which initially had borrowed on behalf of Greece, now had to borrow on behalf of Ireland as well, so it fell. So the ESM contains within its structure, it contains, because the bonds are not solid, they're not homogeneous, they are compartmentalized, fragmented, like the Eurozone is. The ESM contains instability within it. This is why it's not being used. The ESM was created so as not to use it. And I can assure you that the powers that be in Europe, in Berlin, here in Vienna, our politicians are doing everything in their power to make sure that the ESM exists in name, but not in substance. This is why I'm saying that we're reforming in name, but not in reality. Let me give you a second example, which I mentioned before, the banking union. Now, it would be a splendid idea, as Gandhi would have said. We don't have it. We have something we call the banking union, but in effect, what it is, it's common rules governing a banking disunion. Let me put it very briefly. In this country, you have a quite robust banking system compared to ours, or compared to the Portuguese, or compared to the Spanish. And also you have a state whose finances are much more solid than the finances of the Portuguese state or the Greek state. Yeah? What happens if a bank fails in this country? Well, your government's going to bail it out. So if you have €1 million, you don't, but let's say you did. We are economists, we have to be able to assume anything. If you had €1 million in a bank account, you can rest assured that it will be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. But if you have €1 million in a Greek bank, not the same. There's all this talk about the possibility of a bail-in as part of the banking union laws. So if the banks are discovered to have a big black hole in them, which they do, and the state cannot bail them out, then it's a political decision by the Eurogroup, which is made under conditions of complete opacity and lack of transparency, that just like it happened in Cyprus, it could be decided that Greek deposits above the minimum level which is insured, which is 100,000, get bailed in, wiped out, or at least partly wiped out. So 1 million euros in a Greek bank account do not have the same net present value as 1 million, did I say pounds? See, I came from England. 1 million euros in an Austrian bank account do not have the same value as 1 million euros in a Spanish bank account, in a Portuguese bank account, or in a Greek. Is this a banking union? We have a monetary union and a banking union, but the same amount of euros has a different value depending in which bank it's been deposited. This is what you do. How do you design a banking union if you want to make sure that it is disunited and prone to another bout of sequential bankruptcies? And we called it a banking union because in Europe we are excellent at manufacturing beautiful labels, which mean exactly the opposite of the reality that they are meant to describe. Quantitative easing. Mr. Draghi is a highly competent central banker who unfortunately has to operate within a set of rules that could never be respected, simply because they clash with reality. So he has been spending his days and nights worrying about how to bend the rules in order to preserve the unity of the Eurozone, and in the process antagonizes the Bundesbank, which keeps castigating him for bending the rules, which of course he is bending, because otherwise the euro will not survive. Quantitative easing is an attempt to replicate what the Americans did, what the British did, what the Japanese did when interest rates hit zero, and you can no longer stimulate by reducing them to below zero. Because if you reduce them to below zero, people will simply remove their money from the banks, you will have a banking collapse. So quantitative easing is the practice of effectively purchasing from private banks some of their loans, some of the debt that they hold, to give them liquidity, hoping that the banks are then going to lend it to the private sector to stimulate the economy. And it's the only reason why the Eurozone survives, that Draghi tried to do that. But the constraints, the institutional constraints that he's facing are forcing him to buy more German bonds than Spanish bonds, because he has to do it in proportion to GDP so as not to be accused to be preferential vis-à-vis Spain. But Germany does not need its bonds to be purchased, because Germany doesn't have enough bonds. Germany is trying to run a balanced budget, so it's not issuing new bonds. German financial institutions have to keep and buy those bonds for statutory purposes. They are obliged by German law to hold German government debt. So there is not enough supply of German bonds. So Mr. Draghi is forcing himself to buy bonds that he doesn't need, and by buying them, he's creating serious problems for pension funds in this country and in Germany, because interest rates go into negative territory. And pension funds have a serious problem returning a return to their investors, to the prospective pension, to the future pensioners, to current workers. You can't make this up. This is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. We have a central bank which is forced to do things it knows are bad for Europe. And the excuse, of course, is, and it's not a bad excuse, that, well, doing this is better than not doing anything. But, you know, we've had 5, 6, 7 years, ladies and gentlemen, since the financial collapse of 2008, to reconsider what we do, to change the rules. Since when are we the servants of the rules? The rules are there to serve us. Isn't that so? Since when are the rules ends in themselves? They're instruments. And we created them to serve us. So if they no longer serve us, we should sit down sensibly, have a rational discussion and a free exchange, and decide how to change them. But no, that kind of discussion is not allowed. The moment you dare challenge the veracity and rationality of the current rules that everybody's violating, by the way, everybody's violating because they cannot be respected. But if you dare in the Eurogroup begin a conversation, you are faced with the horror, the nightmare of an academic. What is the nightmare of an academic? When you try to articulate an academic argument and your interlocutor says, oh, but this is the way it is because this is the way it is. You say, okay, I know this is how it is. But why should it be that way? Oh, because it is that way. Yes, but why is it that way? Because it is that way. And you can carry on this exchange fruitlessly forever. This is a nightmare. And that nightmare is the state of debate in the great institutions and organizations that are running the world's most significant and substantial economy, which is the Eurozone. What I'm trying effectively to suggest to you is that behind the lull in the bond markets, which was created so dexterously by Mario Draghi, what we have under the surface is increasing deconstruction, increasing divergence. If you look at the Eurozone as one economy, it's getting more fragmented, not less fragmented. You have greater differences today than we had 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 3 years ago, in terms of the viability of debt, private and public. We have a situation where productivity growth and trajectories are moving further apart. We have a situation where the equilibrium level of interest, of the rate of interest, by equilibrium level of the interest rate, we mean the interest rate that should prevail in order to equalize savings and investment. That level in Germany is, in my estimation, around 6%, when the real interest rate now is almost 0. And in Greece is minus 30%. And these differences are getting further apart. So it's like, from a geological point of view, it's like the tectonic plates under our feet are moving in a vicious way against stability. This Eurozone, as we created it, has no future. And unfortunately, there is no forum in Brussels, in Frankfurt, anywhere, where we can actually have this conversation as Europeans. Recently, I was stunned to hear a friend and colleague who happens to be the French Minister of the Economy, Emmanuel Macron. He was standing next to me when we were in a conference, and I heard him use words I could not believe that I was hearing. He actually described the present state of the Eurozone as a religious war between Calvinist Europe and Catholic Europe. And then I said, what about us who are Orthodox atheists? But set this aside. We are at a crossroads. The European Union is failing to respond creatively to its crisis like the Americans always do. Every time they have a crisis, I said this before, it happened again in 2008. They created TAP, the Troubled Assets Relief Program, which actually worked in ways that I was extremely critical of from a social and political point of view because of the redistributive effect that benefited the top 0.1%. But nevertheless, it worked. It stabilized the American economy. Their QE, their quantitative easing, worked to some extent. America is growing at 3%. Here we are pretending that we're growing at 1%. It's not 1%. It's less. Why is this? Well, allow me a sojourn into a little bit of political history. Quirky political history, but nevertheless political history. The United States government, with all its demerits, disadvantages, and problems that it has, and it has plenty, was the result of 2 centuries and more of social conflict. Initially, it was the slave-owning landowners of the South against the merchants of New England, then against the industrialists of Illinois, then the proletariat that got organized in trade unions, many other groups, farmers and so on, who didn't own slaves. These social groups clashed mercilessly. There were the robber barons, the great corporations, then Edison with his own idea about networked corporations and large banks. These were all social groups that were struggling against one another. And politics gave rise to, generated a constitution, a system of political governance that ameliorates for these conflicts and equilibrates them. And in the end, the President of the United States, the government, the administration, can be sacked by the Senate. It is answerable to those representatives who were elected in particularly nasty ways, but nevertheless, they are still representatives. There is a sovereign people. When Americans say we, the people, they mean it. And they have this sense that their government ultimately is answerable to them. Now, compare and contrast this with the European Union. How did it emerge? I know and I appreciate and I am very fond of the idea that we Europeans, especially after the war, had a great penchant for unity, for doing away with borders, for doing away with war. Of course, and we should preserve that penchant. However, the institutions of the European Union did not come into being in the way that the institutions of the British government, or actually the Austrian government, or normal governments were created. How was it created? It was created as a cartel. Let me remind you that the first name for the European Union was the European Community of Coal and Steel. It was a cartel, the purpose of which was to bind together the heavy industries of Central Europe, of Austria, of Germany, of Belgium, of Holland, of France, and northern Italy. That's it. That was the cartel. And in Brussels, like OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, has an administration. That cartel had an administration, and it was in Brussels. So the European Union began life as the administrators, the technocrats, running a cartel. And what does a cartel need more than anything to survive? Stable prices. So OPEC is all about maintaining the price of oil stable and agreements between them on how not to compete on price. That's what the cartel does. That's what we did in Europe in 1950. Initially, it was coal and steel. Then we co-opted the French farmers through the common agricultural policy. Then some other farmers too, but mainly the first French farmers, right? Then we co-opted the car makers. Then we brought in the bankers. So the cartel expanded to take in and to represent more business interests. But it was never a political process for equilibrating and regulating class conflict between different social groups. In the first 20 years, that cartel survived beautifully because of the United States of America. Because the United States of America kept the Bretton Woods system going, which you may have heard of, which was a fixed exchange rate regime. You see, a cartel of steel, where there are factories in Germany, in Austria, in Belgium, in France, in northern Italy, to maintain the price of steel constant when these jurisdictions have different currencies, those currencies must be fixed with one another. And the Americans provided that through Bretton Woods. But that died in 1971 when John Connolly, the US Treasury Secretary, visited Europe and said, it's our currency, the dollar, but it's your problem from now on. You're unhinged, off you go. And then suddenly the Deutschmark started going up, the Italian lira started going to go down, the French franc was going up and down, and the cartel was in danger of being completely destroyed by this divergence in currencies. This is why the drive to create the euro began. Initially, it was a snake, then it became the European monetary system in 1978, Helmut Schmidt and Giscard d'Estaing, then it was the European exchange rate mechanism, all that failed. They tried, it succeeded for a while, then it was toppled by market forces. So they decided that you need to replace this whole thing by a single currency. That's the only way of genuinely fixing the exchange rates. But think of this. What have we done? We started with institutions that govern the economic union, that are effectively the technocracy, the CEOs of a cartel of heavy industry. And then on top of that, we overlaid a currency. You know, a currency is a highly political creature. The idea that you can have apolitical money is both false and very dangerous. Money needs to be governed by a political process, because who sets interest rates determines the distribution of income and the prospects of growth. And that is a political question. And you don't have to be a left-winger to say that. Do you know who actually said that? In precisely those words, who sets interest rates is a political matter that must not be divulged to technocrats. Margaret Thatcher, House of Commons, her last appearance as Prime Minister. She was right. I hate to say that, but she was right. So he tried to create an apolitical money and graft it on top of a bureaucracy that did not represent a political process. In other words, we created a monetary union, a macroeconomy, as if it was a democracy-free zone. Now, if you ever spend any time in Brussels, and I hope you don't, inside the corridors of power, I think you will recognize that which I'm now going to describe to you. A genuine Platonic contempt for democracy. When I dared say on the 27th of June in the Eurogroup that our government was going to put to the Greek people the ultimatum presented to us, by the Troika. Because on the one hand, by reading it as an economist, I could say that this is not sustainable. On the other hand, I didn't have a mandate or an interest in clashing with my colleagues in the Eurogroup. But as a Democrat, because this document and my signature or lack thereof on it would determine the future of 1 or 2 generations in Greece and possibly Europe, I felt I had a duty to take it to the Greek people, and so did the Prime Minister, and say to them, yes or no. This is what I've been presented with as a take it or leave it offer. Do you want it or not? And I was castigated for daring to put such complicated issues to unsophisticated members of the public. These were the words that were used as criticism of me and of my Prime Minister and of our government's decision to call for a referendum. And I turned around and said, you have just challenged the notion of democracy. What is democracy? It is a terrible system where big decisions about the future of a nation, economic decisions, political decisions, social decisions, are determined by the very weird principle of one person, one vote. It doesn't matter how rich or poor, educated, illiterate, clever or stupid you are, you get one vote. And you use it in order to determine the future of your nation, the future of your economy. That's the principle of democracy. It's a terrible system, but as Winston Churchill said, it's the best of all alternatives. That process of democracy inside our European Union institutions, of course, they pay lip service to it. No one is going to declare themselves to be non-democratic. But I can assure you that for them, democracy is an electoral process that simply validates what it is that they've done. It is not a process by which to determine what happens, what is being done. In a sense, they remind me of Henry Ford, who sold the T-model, the first mass-produced car, under the slogan, you can have it in any color you want, as long as it's black. This is how I felt in the Eurogroup. You can have any program you want, as long as it's this one. And this one was not decided, deliberated upon democratically. It was not even decided in the Eurogroup. It was decided by the Troika, the representatives of the institutions that no one elected. Now, the reason why this is significant, and again I'm coming back to the relative insignificance of Greece, is that this matters to you. You live in the hub of Europe, at the center of gravity of Europe. Do you want to grow up and into a society where the big decisions about your lives are made by bureaucrats whose name you don't even know, whom you wouldn't even recognize on the street, who have a contempt for your right to cast a ballot, and by that ballot, not simply to validate what they are doing, but to direct them into what should be done? In recent weeks, the number one topic, thankfully, is no longer Greece, but it's the crisis of our moral fiber that is also known as the refugee crisis. I have no doubt, having observed the way that Europe has been caught up in these centrifugal forces that are tearing it apart as a result of the failures of governance of our monetary union, that the way in which we're failing to deal collectively with the refugee issue is to a very large extent due to the fact that we are under this process, we have been under this process of deconstruction of every nation renationalizing its ambition and trying to think of its interest as separate from the interest of other nations in the European Union. The way in which we are all trying to free ride on everybody else. The way in which everybody wants to shove the problem, whatever that problem is, onto the backyard of the neighbors. It is preposterous that in this day and age, I have journalists coming to me and saying, challenging through their questioning, my view that when somebody knocks on your door who happens to be dying, shot, hungry, or scared, what you do is you open the door and you let them in independently of the pros and cons of the cost-benefit analysis of that action. The fact that we have failed in our duty to our history as Europeans, to our humanity, to the people who are washed off on our shores in Greece, in Italy, the fact that we have failed is not unconnected to the way in which we are failing to take control of the political process, which the bureaucrats and certain politicians feel that it is within their rights to depoliticize. The problem with depoliticizing a political process is that you end up with terrible economics and toxic, anti-human, misanthropic politics. So it's time that we took our responsibility to our collective history seriously. And let me leave you with this thought. Either we're going to democratize the European Union, or this European Union is going to abolish itself, falling prey to forces of history and reality that this architecture of ours was never designed to sustain. I suspect that most of us would castigate or characterize as utopian the idea that it is time that Europeans transcend borders and start a conversation amongst themselves about common European problems, hoping to bring about a consensus that then will find electoral political expression in our own countries, in our own municipalities. This is what I'm working towards. This is what I think is absolutely of the essence of the moment. Of course it is utopian, but the alternative is dystopian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yanis. And let me say too how glad I am that we have you back in Vienna this evening. We had you as our guest 2 years ago, and now we are here in a different location. Yanis, what you said is in a way that we should bring Europe to another path. In these 5 exciting months as a Minister of Finance in Greece, did you sometime have the feeling, the impression that you have a chance to bring the Eurozone to another path?
Not when I was in the Eurogroup, but when I walked on the streets of Berlin, of Paris, of Lisbon, of Vienna, the answer is absolutely yes. Our leadership, our bureaucracies, our technocracies, our institutions are well outside the demands of history and reality. They are completely overtaken by events. They keep insisting on a model that has failed. Of course, Europe is rich enough to keep throwing good money after bad and to prolong this current state of affairs. Remember what happened to the Soviet Union, though? There was a great political will to keep that thing together. And they kept it together for a very long time against the logic of the political economy, of the social economy of the Soviet Union. But when you use political brute force to maintain an unsustainable system, what happens is you may succeed in prolonging it, but when the implosion happens, it happens very quickly and is very large. And I very much hope that we don't end up in the same situation with the Eurozone and in the European Union. I believe that if we continue along this road, we're going to end up in that situation. I believe that also, and that is the optimistic part, especially after I resigned and stopped even being a member of parliament, I've been traveling around for purposes that you understand because you've seen me in action now. I'm trying to create a European conversation that is going to counteract the inanity at the seats of power. And wherever I go, I have a great deal of interaction and positive feelings from the places I go. But that is very important, has nothing to do with who I am, personally, and it has nothing to do with Greece. It's not an act of solidarity to Greece. My feeling is that when I'm in Barcelona, in Madrid, in Berlin, there is a great deal of concern about Barcelona, Madrid, and Berlin. The people who come and talk to me, and to people like me, are concerned about their town, their neighborhood, their country, their Europe. And they're beginning to see that Greece is just a laboratory in which idiocy and inefficiency breed terrible policies, which will then travel to their town, to their locality, to their nation. And as long as this sensation is built up, there is a possibility of the conversation that may lead to the consensus which is essential for us to change European politics. And if we don't change European politics, I'm afraid we're simply going to be observers of the implosion of the dream of European integration.
But we have now, in the time you governed, but also in these days, we have this split within Europe. Yeah, you have the situation that in Greece, in Spain, generally in countries from the south, but also in a way in Great Britain now with the new Labour leadership, the search for new ways. And you don't have this search for new ways, let's say in Germany, in Northern Europe, but not in the same way. Did your government, you were part of, did you, and also we as comrades in the North, make mistakes? Didn't we fail in a way that we were not ready to build alliances, civil society alliances, party alliances, but also alliances with political forces, let's say in social democratic parts of Western Europe, which might have been, let's say, allies or half allies. Did you also alienate them in a way? Were there mistakes? Could things happen better? What do you think?
Anyone who claims that they haven't made mistakes is a dangerous idiot. But let me also add that whenever I went to Germany as a minister, I faced a bifurcation, two different worlds. And that, I don't mean by that a division within the people. There was one audience that was informed about what I was saying from the media, and they thought that I was devil incarnate. And then there was another audience that actually heard me, and that was a completely different story. So the media play a very important role here. Now, of course, I made an allusion before to 1929, and I compared it to 2008. Remember, in 1929, we had a financial sector collapse, the common currency started imploding, and then people started turning against each other. And the left failed spectacularly to arrest this political process. And who won? The Nazis and the fascists and all sorts of assorted misanthropes. We have a rerun of this. Hopefully Marx was right that history repeats itself as a farce, and hopefully this is a farcical version of what happened in the 30s, but not necessarily. At least it is important to understand that this division of peoples, of north, south, east, west, and then division within nations, is a natural repercussion of an economic system that cannot survive its own contradictions. Our job is to try to move politically against that through rational argumentation, through moderate language, through appealing across borders and across social divides. I believe that this is very early days yet. We can't say we failed, because I think that the struggle begins now.
Do you think for sure you failed on your on the aims you had, but do you think that it's totally a failure, or can we say that that there are some little successes in that, because some things became clear? It became now everybody knows, or more people than before know, that austerity doesn't work. Yeah. Now more people know how this Eurozone is governed in a, let's say, way of authoritarian governing. So is this a success that we see that now?
Well, I think so, but I would say that, wouldn't I? No, the fact that you folks now know that the Eurogroup does not take minutes. So you, as historians in the future, as citizens, you will never be able to find out what your finance minister said in each of those important Eurogroups. You will never be able to find this out. That is an assault on democratic principle and on propriety, especially those who supposedly believe in rules and rule-based behavior, when they tell me in the Eurogroup meeting that there are no rules because it's an informal group and there are no written rules. Now I think it's important that people should know that in Europe, that Europeans should know that their economy is governed by a secret society, unaccountable secret society who are themselves uninformed. Remember what I was saying, that your Minister of Finance did not have in front of him our proposals or the Troika proposals until the very last moment when it was all done and the banks were closing in Greece. Yeah? But allow me a historical parallelism again. Remember the Prague Spring? It was crashed by the Soviet tanks. Our Athens Spring was crashed by the banks. The Prague rebellion was subdued through brutish force, so was ours. But the Prague Spring was not a failure, even though it was crashed, because the Soviet Union never recovered morally at the level of ethical discourse and political discourse. Most of well-thinking communists disavowed the Soviet Communist Party after the Prague Springs crashing. I believe and I trust that what happened in July in the Eurogroup and in the European Council meetings, where the Greek government, our government, was forced to accept a huge new loan on conditions that ensured that we will not be able to recover, and the Greek Prime Minister was effectively waterboarded for 17 hours until he signed, at the threat that the banks would never open again. I think that was a defeat for us, but it was a wounding of Europe. And Europeans will respond to this in the way that Eastern Europeans responded to the crashing of the Prague Spring.
You call it a defeat. You call it a defeat, but as we know from history or from our experience, there are that kind of defeats and that kind of defeats. I mean, the crashing of the Prague Spring was a big defeat. You call the defeat or this dramatic days in July a capitulation of your government. But is it really a capitulation? I mean, nobody could think that you win this fight, or we win this fight, to bring Europe to another path will be won within five months.
No, but we could have done better. Come on, let's be, it's not 0-1. It's not binary. We could have done better. We had certain weapons at our disposal which we didn't use in the end. And had we used them, I think that we would
Which
end up...
weapon would it be?
I've spoken about this extensively, but let me briefly mention them. One was that we owed 27 billion to the ECB from a 2010 era purchase of Greek government bonds that were in Greek law. We could have haircut those, and that would have created a serious problem for the European Central Bank. And why would I want to create a problem for the ECB? I wouldn't. But if the ECB closes down our banks, which is a major act of terror, as far as I'm concerned, there's nothing more capable of inspiring terror in people than the idea that the banks will never open again. So they did this in order to force our government to succumb. So I thought that it was well within our right at that point to haircut those bonds that we owed to the ECB. If we had done that, it would have been a different story. If we had announced the creation of an electronic parallel payment system just to give us some degrees of freedom, if we had fought for another week after the referendum, instead of surrendering immediately after the Greek people gave us a mandate to fight, I think that we would have had a better deal, an honorable agreement, not an agreement that I would like, but an agreement that would leave all of us slightly dissatisfied, which is the mark of a decent agreement. And I think that would have been good for Europe.
Maybe you can describe a little bit how this was a discussion in your government. Obviously, you had differences, strong differences in opinion to your prime minister. How is your relationship with him now?
Oh, you're becoming journalistic now.
I think people are interested in that.
I'm sure they are. But allow me to be very sparing about this, because this was a traumatic period. Alexis Tsipras and I were very close. I'm still very fond of him. Even though our paths have diverged, we disagreed seriously. I will never pass a negative comment about him, personally. I won't divulge what was said in there. I can tell you that whatever was said in a comradely spirit. It was a genuine disagreement. It was a very hard choice. I recognize that it was a superbly hard choice. And what is the definition of hard choice in philosophy? It's a choice where there are excellent arguments on both sides. So it's not that he didn't have arguments for doing what he did. I thought that he made the wrong choice, but I want to maintain, well, to maintain a posture of not falling into the trap that the left used to fall into, of denouncing one another and descending into a sectarian shouting match. So I'm not going to do that.
To come back to the question which was already put forward to you, the question, young people here, we and our co-organizers are studying here economics, macro theory, all this thing. And they think that it's an important knowledge to bring economic, social, democratic progress to our societies. And then they realize in the political field, nobody is interested in that. And the question was, are they studying the wrong thing?
Yes. But let me expand upon it. Political economics is a magnificent discipline. It's, if you want to think of it as a terrain on which many different armies of ideas are clashing mercilessly. And it's a kind of, worldly philosophy, as Robert Heilbronner once said in the title of his famous book, The Worldly Philosophers. Unfortunately, over the last 30 years, neoliberalism in politics, financialization in the banking sector, and a particular form of vulgar economics have conspired to create an ideological defense for indefensible economic policies. And let me be now precise, since we are, I believe, in the economics department. Yes? Yes. Well, allow me to be a bit more economic, just for a moment. The grave error that economists make, and not just neoclassical economists, even Marx made that error. I consider myself to be an erratic, inconsistent Marxist because I'm critical of Marx in this particular regard. Economists are lured by their own rhetoric, a bit like politicians. They love to hear their own voices when they speak in mathematical language. So mathematics is an extremely beautiful instrument. It's an extremely beautiful language. And also, it's extremely powerful. Because if you can prove a theorem, suddenly you feel like a mini god. Because you have an ultimate truth. If the theorem is correct, it's not a matter of opinion. Isn't that fantastic? Imagine if we could transform that certainty into a political narrative. That it's not my opinion that we must, reduce interest rates to 0.8%. It's a truth. Nothing gives politicians more power than access to a theory which enables them to speak in terms of the truth, not in terms of their opinion about the truth. Yeah? So the moment you start describing an economic problem in mathematical terms, mathematics takes over. Let me put it this way. Imagine, suppose that I were to give you two equations and two unknowns. Don't you have an urge to solve it? Maybe you don't. I do. I have an urge to solve it, to find a solution. And if I find a solution, I feel good about it. Hmm? That's what mathematics does to you. So if you mathematicize your view of economics, then you have a tendency to seek determinate solutions, like mathematicians do. Now, the problem with this, when applied to economics, is that there are no determinate solutions in economic systems. And this is something that we've learned the hard way through periods of depression and so on. And that was a contribution, if you want, of two economists. I'm going back to my roots now, being a professor. Thomas Malthus was one, and John Maynard Keynes was the other. And let's come to a period of crisis to illustrate this. During a crisis, there are two manifestations of the crisis. One is a mountain of debts, unpayable debts and banking losses. In a crisis, you have people who've gone bankrupt, states that have gone bankrupt, corporations. So there's a mountain of debt. But there's also another mountain that usually is overlooked. It's a mountain of idle savings, savings that are accumulating, and the savers, or the banks that have them, are too frightened to invest them in productive activities. Why? Because they fear that the demand will not be there for the goods and services that these investments are going to produce, and then they will lose their money. And when that fear is widespread, there is a general equilibrium of pessimism, then those fears are self-fulfilling. Investors think, other investors will not invest. So if investors do not invest, there will not be enough demand out there, not enough jobs will be created, not enough income will be there, people will not buy those goods, so if I invest, I'm going to lose my money. So if this is quite widespread, then what happens is nobody invests, and then there isn't the demand, and they say, see, we were right not to invest. So you have self-confirming negative expectations. But that is not a determinate solution, because it could be different. If everybody was optimistic, then they would all invest, and they would all say, see, we were right to invest. So you have what we call in economics multiple equilibria. And when you have multiple equilibria, it's like having an indeterminate system of equations that yield many different solutions. It's like having a meteorological model that tells you that tomorrow it may rain, it may shine, it may snow, and there may be hail. It's a useless model. When you predict everything, you're predicting nothing. So our mathematical models, because they deal with social interactions where there are multiple equilibria, are by definition indeterminate. Now, nobody gets published in academia if they write an article in which they say, the conclusion is, I don't know what will happen. I'm damned if I know. The only reality, however, is that you are damned if you know. So the economists' careers are based on squeezing determinate solutions out of mathematical models. But the only way you can do that is by abstracting from reality, from capitalism, to such an extent that those models have nothing to do with capitalism. So you have a choice. Either you're going to be sensible in the way you discuss capitalism, but then you don't get published and you don't become a professor, or you are going to create beautiful economic models, mathematical economic models, that have nothing to do with capitalism, but which are functional to the interests of financiers because they come up with determinate solutions which resonate with the financiers' riskless risk models, where they try to sell like snake oil salesmen to investors these products which supposedly will never crash. So you have a terrible interchange feedback effect between beautiful mathematical economic models that have nothing to do with capitalism, with the practices of the financial sector that bring about the collapse of capitalism. And that is a terrible, vicious feedback effect. So the economic discipline is terribly contributing to financial instability and to economic crisis, has been doing for 30 years. John Maynard Keynes was significant, not because of all the hundreds of pages that he wrote, but because he managed to say this one thing: we are damned if we know. When we are in a depression, anything can happen. When we are not in a depression can happen tomorrow, and there is no way of predicting when it will happen. Capitalism has a tendency to fall on its face and not to rise up again. And when it falls on its face, it needs a helping hand. And you need to have institutions that give it that helping hand. Or otherwise, you get caught up in a debt deflationary crisis like Greece is in. One last thing about the mathematical models. The only way to actually solve these equations is by assuming that in those models, only one person lives. Because you can have two things in mathematical models. You have a choice between two options. One is to have heterogeneity, to have lots of different consumers and producers and so on, but have no time. Time is one moment, and everything happens in that moment, and then you can solve the mathematics if you have lots of different people in different firms. So you can have heterogeneity, but no time. That is a useless model. Or you can have time, but one person, a Robinson Crusoe, who employs himself, and he pays himself a wage, so he can never be unemployed. So I mentioned that before. So if you look at all the macroeconomic policies that came out of the economics departments and the economics models that were used by the central banks, governments, and so on in the last 30 years, they come out of models where in reality there is a single person, a hidden Robinson Crusoe in them. So imagine that. We created policies on the assumption that there can be no unemployment. Now, how silly is that?
Yanis, to go on with that, if you have something like a basic argument, I think, if I'm allowed to interpret you a little bit. Also, it's generally the case when leftists go back to the suitcase of John Maynard Keynes, and the basic argument is if there are institutions which are workable, and if there is a politics made which is reasonable, then this capitalism can be stabilized and can be brought to a track of progress and to be prosperous. And this was generally right in history. But what if that is not right anymore? What when this is wrong now? I go back to these discussions about secular stagnation, slow growth, the rising inequality, also the point our friend Jamie Galbraith is making in his new book about the end of normal. All this are elements to come to the idea that maybe something changed and this capitalism isn't the capitalism anymore Keynes wrote about. It's a little bit more of a capitalism. Might this be, what do you think about this? Is this something we should think a about at least?
Yes, but we Europeans can't afford to. This could be a sensible conversation to have in the United States, in China, in India, but not in the Eurozone. The Eurozone is replete with so much irrationality in the way that we've structured it, that if capitalism is kaput, as you put it, European capitalism is kaput to the power of 3. And there are things we can do tomorrow in Europe to stabilize it a lot more than it is now, and to end this fragmentation. We can solidify the Eurozone. Let me put it this way. We can simulate what the Americans have done. The American economy is in dire straits, is in deep trouble. So is the global capitalist economy. As I said, I'm a Marxist. I'm not going to say that capitalism can be civilized and be rendered completely stable and beautiful and wonderful. I'm never going to say that. But European capitalism is a basket case. And we are a major threat to the rest of the globe. We are the sick person of the global economy. We're creating serious problems for the United States, serious problems for Brazil, serious problems primarily for China, by not doing some basic things we could do. And let me just give you one very brief example of how a Keynesian policy could be applied here without governments. Because governments are already at the limit of their fiscal space. Now, remember before I was describing quantitative easing, when the ECB is purchasing bonds and Austrian debt, which is silly. Instead of that, without violating any of the treaties, any of the charters, any of the regulations, imagine we were to, our leaders at the European Union Council were to get together this month and decide that we need a new deal for Europe, specializing particularly on green energy, tech companies, startups, green industry, which we really need a lot more of in Europe. We are in a terrible state regarding planning for energy use and the environment and all that. And these are very heavily, they are very capital intensive and knowledge intensive industries. So imagine we were to say that as of this year, we're going to spend 7% of GDP, of Euro area GDP, investing in these areas. Who's going to invest? The European Investment Bank. It belongs to all of us. It doesn't belong to any particular government. It belongs to the European Union. How will the European Investment Bank find the money to do it? It issues bonds. It's been issuing bonds for 25 years. Well, issue a lot of them to soak up all this idle cash, which is slashing around in the banking system of Europe, destabilizing the banking system, especially in the surplus countries. And then the ECB, instead of buying bonds and Austrian government bonds, it can buy those EIB bonds. And then it would not be inflating the stock exchange, inflating inequality, but it will be supporting the investment into good quality jobs in technologically important sectors producing green energy. Now, the very announcement of this would be stabilizing. Let me give you another example we could do. You may have heard that our European system of central banks is structured in a rather funny way. We have kept our central banks, the Austrian central bank, the Greek one, the Bundesbank, and so on. And every time there is a transaction across borders, one central bank acquires a liability with regard to another one. And when there is an imbalance, so when the flow of capital into one country is greater than the flow of capital of the other country into the one country, then interest accumulates in the central bank of the surplus country. And that interest, which is not a return on investment, it's not a return on a loan, this is an accounting facility, that interest then is dispersed to the surplus countries. So the surplus countries benefit not only from having net exports, but also from this which is called the target 2 account. Now, consider this, that money is not dispersed to the target 2 money, profits or interest, are not dispersed to the governments of the surplus countries, but go into a poverty-fighting fund for the Eurozone. And we create something like the United States food stamp program. Imagine if a poor family in Austria, in Greece, in Ireland, in Lithuania, were to receive a check or a food stamp that they could cash at the local supermarket to put food on the table for their children, signed by Mario Draghi on behalf of the ECB. Think of what solidifying, unifying effect that would have on Europe. These are things we can do, and then we can talk about the problems of capitalism generally.
As we know, and as you made as experience in the first 6 months of this year, let's say the reasonable things won't spread only by giving good arguments to the silly conservatives in governments in Europe, and then they will become more bright, and then they will do the reasonable thing. As we all know, there has to be a change of relationship of forces in an intellectual way, in a political way, in an economic way. Do you think that there are good possibilities or some possibilities in the next months, in the next years, that this relationship of forces might change? If you look, for example, the possible elections in Spain, the situation now we have in Portugal, but also the kind of traveling around you are doing now. You're traveling around with the idea of building alliances, a new alliance. What kind of alliance? So are you generally optimistic that we can get it?
Axiomatically, yes. I believe that that's what it means to be a humanist. We have no evidence that human beings are good. We cannot prove it. History is replete with examples of nastiness, of particularly organized and orchestrated human nastiness. But I believe that to be a humanist means to axiomatically accept that human beings are essentially good, and that we can, through rational arguments and discussions, we can bring together this goodness into good outcomes. I assume that, I can't prove it, and I hope you assume it too. The answer to your question must be that this is not a spectator sport. It's not a question of, you're watching a football match and you think, do you think there's a chance that, Munich Bayern are now going to score a goal? Because that is independent of what you do. The answer to your question, therefore, is there a chance that we can alter the course of history and arrest this fragmentation of the Eurozone? That depends on us, on all of us.
Yes, but it's also a question of a fight. It's a question of a fight with two sides, or maybe three sides. It's a question, but it's always a question of a fight. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your idea of this new alliance. I think people who read about it don't really know till now what kind of thing should it be. Should it be a new party? Should it be a grassroots movement? What should it be?
Okay, well, very briefly, because people are getting tired, I think, of us. Very briefly, one lesson I learned in the last 6, 8, 10 months is that the old model of doing politics, where you set up a party in your nation state, you come up with a manifesto, and you offer your fellow citizens in Austria or me in Greece all sorts of things which you cannot deliver in the context of the Eurozone and the European Union. And then you get elected, and you find yourself in government but not in power. And then you go to the Eurogroup, the European Union Council, and you're not even part of the decision-making process. You pretend to be. You just participate in the family photo opportunity. Yeah? And then you come back and you have to find excuses as to why you did not fulfill your manifesto. This is finished. This is leading us down the garden path, as they say. What is the alternative? The only alternative I can imagine is what we're doing now. That is, to start a conversation across borders on our common problems, which are the problems that impede a national government from having power. If that conversation produces a consensus of what we want to do, and I'll come up with some ideas of that, what that might be, then that consensus will energize agents, not spectators, to self-organize and to find an expression of that European-wide consensus in their own home country. In the first stages, this is not a party, this is a conversation, it's a movement, it's a network, it's a platform. When that conversation evolves into having an electoral expression, then people will have to decide whether they want to be part of a particular party that seeks votes. But at this first phase, I would like everyone to contribute independently of national party affiliation. And we should also see it not just as a network of nations, of citizens, but also of cities, of communities, of social groups, of civil society, because this is the only way of countering these centrifugal forces that are pulling us apart. As I said, it sounds utopian, but the alternative is a horrible dystopia.
Thank you, Yanis. I would, as you see, I would have 100 more questions, but also some people from this huge audience should have the possibility to put forward some questions to you in the last 20 minutes or 25 minutes we have.
But in the refugee question, for example, or in the solidarity question, now all over Europe.
Willi, du kriegst da.
Excuse me, but I agree. So I agree completely with your purpose, and I want to honor your courage. Not only your courage, but I was in Greece. I made a big study about psychosocial consequences of crisis. I'm a psychotherapist, and I have a lot of colleagues there. And it's a real deep humanitarian crisis with many people suffering a lot. And the refugee question, for example, civil societies, even in our country, in everywhere along the Balkan routes, we see a failure of our governments. Not only we cannot, but we see really a deep humanitarian engagement of civil societies, and this can move a lot. And I think what you call this movement to create it. Parts of this movement are existing all around Europe, and they have to join. We have to make this common movement all over Europe from different parts of different themes also.
To overcome the loneliness that we feel when we're doing this thing at the local level, and to know that we are part of a much, much bigger movement which spans the whole width and breadth of the European Union, but also one which constantly focuses on Brussels and our governments. Imagine, just for 1 second, just imagine that when the European Union Council meetings takes place and our leaders go there to discuss the refugee crisis, imagine that their deliberations are live streamed. What a difference that would make.
The gentleman in the fourth row, I think, or fifth.
Hello, Yanis. Welcome to Vienna. I'm very pessimistic about the future of democracy. What would you think is the best alternative to democracy? And or should we improve the democracy by having more national referendums and giving the population more power? And one more question, what do you think about the role of the media? How can we improve the role of the media? Maybe by having more democratic space in the media, or should we control the media? What's your opinion?
Oh, you're asking very simple and easy questions, aren't you? Look, there is no alternative to democracy. But what we have now is not democracy. So the alternative to what we have now is democracy. And it... No. What we now have is elections. And we elect politicians. But you see, democracy is not about the mechanics of elections. Democracy is about... Aristotle used to define democracy as rule by the underprivileged, because by definition in his mind, the underprivileged are the majority. So if you believe in majority rule, you believe that you should have a system where the underprivileged can dismiss their government. Now, since the large issues are settled at the level of the European Union, until and unless we have a way of electing representatives in such a way that where I can vote for an Austrian member and you can vote for a Greek member, and those members, those representatives of ours can go to the Eurogroup and say, you are all fired, then we will have democracy. On the question of the media, I don't think that there is anyone in this room who's been more vilified than me by the media and who has seen them at work. But I'm not going to make any harsh recommendations about this. My strategy is to ignore them. And my strategy is to try to foment genuine debate amongst active citizens who treat the media in the way that the dissidents in the Soviet Union treated the media of the Soviet Union, with contempt. They would listen to it and never believe anything they said. This is what is happening in Greece today. The Greek people are bombarded by toxic propaganda from bankrupt media, corrupt media, and nobody pays any attention to them. This is a great moment because you have social media, you have alternative media growing through the woodwork, through the internet. And if our democratic movement gains strength, those media that are now dominant will either perish like the dinosaurs or they will have to adapt. I think they are.
The lady in the, I think, fourth row. Yeah, yes.
Hello. I would just like to ask you for 1 minute to imagine that you're indeed a Greek person as you are, but you're in with your 33.
With what?
With your 33 years of age.
33.
Yeah.
Okay.
Having left your country for the last 2 years, actually because you tried to kind of survive and be employed, feeling respect for the country who welcomed you and gave you a job. And I would like to ask you what you would do in this position if you would stay abroad and try to make something, or if you would try to go back to your country, Greece, and what would that mean for you as an individual and also for your country? And the reason why I'm asking this, because I really believe that everything in life is a matter of perspective. And for example, the perspective of many people in this room might be that indeed Greece might be a lab, as you described before, and I don't know, the power corridors of Europe might indeed experiment with Greece. But for example, my perspective is different, and I feel the rat in the lab.
And you feel?
The rat, the mouse in the lab.
Oh.
Yeah, and I wait to see the next experiment.
Right. Well, let me begin by saying that when I entered politics, which was last January, actually, I entered with a very specific promise, which I gave to my electors. And it was this. In my estimation, I said to them, since 2010, we are doing this extending and pretending, and the result is that Greece is being turned into a Kosovo, and a protectorate that has the euro, with the only export that's worth anything being its young people. And until and unless we end this extending and pretending, new loans on conditions that cannot be met, which destroy the dignity of the Greek people, destroy jobs, ensure the closure of firms, and therefore fuel further emigration of the most talented Greeks, until and unless we stop that, there's nothing else to discuss. And my promise was that I would go as a finance minister to the Eurogroup to negotiate the end of this extending and pretending. And indeed, this is what I tried to do. I said to my colleagues, I said to the people of the Troika from the beginning that we are prepared to compromise on everything in our program, just to set everything aside except one thing. We wanted to have an agreement with them which they and their staff, especially the IMF staff, could look at me in the eye and say, this is doable. We also believe this is doable. And that meant three things, if I may say quickly what it meant. It meant, firstly, a restructure of the debt in order to make sure that investors do not look at the Greek state debt and think, oh, this is a bankrupt place. They will never be able to meet their repayments next year, so why am I going to invest today? First. Second, a guarantee from the Greek government that we would never go in deficit again, but at the same time not to be setting ourselves surplus targets that are so large that nobody believes in them. Thirdly, a development bank which would use privatization and public assets in a way that creates an investment flow into productive activities, homegrown investment flow. And fourthly, a bad bank by which to deal with the non-performing loans that clog up the banking system. And even though we are recapitalizing those banks, the result is that there is no credit to profitable firms. That was my promise. Unfortunately, I can assure you that we never had this conversation with the Troika, because the Troika was only interested in overturning and overthrowing our government for reasons that have nothing to do with Greece. And at that point, in an attempt to remain faithful to the promise I made to the Greek people and to those who voted for me, I stepped out. I resigned. On the question that on the last point you made, that you feel like a guinea pig in a laboratory, you have every right to feel that way. Because Greece is a massive laboratory in which over the last 5-6 years, very powerful vested interests, both local and international, have been trying out toxic policies before they transplant them elsewhere. And the result is the mass migration, which is the greatest source of pain for me personally. I was a professor, still am, for many years. Excellent Greek students with masters, PhDs, were queuing up outside my office once upon a time to get reference letters to go and do a postdoc or a PhD abroad. Since 2010, they've been queuing up to get reference letters to migrate forever. And that is a catastrophe.
The colleague here in the 5th row, I think, or 6th row.
First of all, thank you very much again for your talk and for your presence here. I was wondering, I usually assume that most politicians actually have honest and good intentions about helping their country. And so I wonder, you, having been one of those politicians yourself, have you been able to identify, first of all, major obstacles as to why people with good intentions and with actual ideas of policies do not actually manage to make a difference? And second of all, now that we have established that people who have studied economics have made the wrong decisions about how to fix things, what would you suggest to someone who says, hey, I want to make a difference and I want to make as much a difference as I can? Where would you then recommend them to have a look?
On the first question, there are some very good politicians, some very good people. Let's not be, sort of black and white about this. The problem is that the political system that we have in Europe, and elsewhere, but in Europe in particular, if you want, it's an inverse Darwinian process. It weeds out good people because it creates so many disincentives for good people to be part of a terrible system. So even those who walk in there with the best of intentions, either they will have to sell their soul to an awful process, or they leave. So I never focus my criticism on persons, their DNA, their personal characteristics. I focus on the machinery of politics, which should be encouraging good people to stay in politics and not to leave it. On the second question, my recommendation to students always was, do what you love, but critically. It doesn't matter what you study. If you want to change the world, to make it a better place, make sure that you do that which makes you excited to wake up in the morning and do it, but never do it slavishly. Always approach your own ideology, your own discipline, your own method with the utmost of critical disposition.
Okay, so my question is about the democracy in Europe and what you said before about this. And that is, do you believe that the hard line of the Troika in the Greek financial crisis was in part also due to their fears of other left-wing successes in Europe, say in Spain or Portugal, further on?
Well, look, the reason why we're crushed was so as to ensure that the people of Spain... Let me give you an example. On the 13th of July, when Alexis Tsipras was, in the end, forced to capitulate, Mariano Rajoy, the Spanish Prime Minister, took the Greek memorandum that Tsipras had that sign in front of television camera and said, "This is what you get if you vote for Spain's Syriza. And this is why we're crushed." Yeah? And this is why Podemos was dealt a significant blow. But think about it. It's a very sad day when in Europe you condemn a country to become a laboratory, of debt deflation. You push it further into the mire. For what? For political purposes? To ensure that your friends get re-elected in Spain or in Ireland? This is not a well-functioning political system. And that is something that can only be changed through a surge of a European movement that can effectively put the fear of God in these people.
In der dritten Reihe von hinten mit so einem lila, genau, da.
Hello, thank you for being here. I would ask you so many questions, but I'm going to do it briefly. First of all, you once said in an interview with Salvados in Spain, with Jordi Évole, I don't know if you remember that, you said once that you didn't care about what your voters had to say about your decisions.
About my?
Your decisions.
I didn't care what my voters said about my decision. I never said that.
I don't mean it. I really don't interpret it this way that you really don't care about them. But we always discuss in our classes in economics that politicians nowadays behave just in short-term rationality and short-term maximization. This means just acting in one way, so the voters are like in a short term satisfied with their actions. What do you think about that? And I think this was my interpretation of your words back then. Not that you really don't care about what they think. I really don't think that. But
no, I mean, look, I, to be honest with you, I don't remember this interview, but I give 10 a day, so I wouldn't. But let me tell you what I think about this issue. I don't think that politicians are there in order to simply reflect the views of their voters. As I said before, I believe in interaction. I believe that I look at voters as agents, and my relationship with them as a conversation. In a conversation, you have disagreement. You influence one another. They influence you, you influence them. The idea of a politician who constantly uses pollsters to find out what his voters want and then tries to deliver that is an abomination for me. Leadership means to be able to say to voters things they may not want to hear, but at the same time listening to them and having this dialectic, the Socratic dialectic between them and you.
We have to leave very soon this room, so I can take only two people now. The first one is the lady there.
So we have all been following the story of Greece this year a lot, right? And we read all the details about what Syriza did in Brussels and how the conversations went. But there was one thing that was never answered in the media, and it was this like big mysterious secret. But
what?
maybe you can talk about it, the Eurogroup.
Yeah.
Like when you go into this room talking to Schäuble and all these other crazy people, like what really happens in the room? Like no one ever told us what is it? Is it werewolves or like what is it that happens? Like people go in with an opinion and they come out with another one. Like
no, let me tell you what happens in the Eurogroup. Yeah? What happens in the Eurogroup is this. Firstly, it's a large rectangular table. And along the long sides of the table sit the finance ministers. Yeah? On the shorter sides of the table are the representatives of the Troika, of the institutions. So on one side is Dijsselbloem, who is the president. Next to him is his sidekick, an Austrian, Thomas Wieser, who is running the Euro Working Group, which is the cabinet of the Eurogroup. And next to that person is the representative of the International Monetary Fund. Sometimes it's Christine Lagarde when she comes. Other times it's Paul Thompson, who is the IMF person responsible for Europe. And then there is Klaus Regling from the ESM on the other side. That's not that important. On the other side of the table, again, the Troika is Moscovici representing the Commission, and Dombrovskis, the Latvian, who's sitting next to him. And of course, the most significant person is Mario Draghi, representing the ECB, who actually is neighboring Wolfgang Schäuble, who is always at that corner, next to Mario Draghi. Okay? And what happens is, let's say that we're discussing Greece or Portugal or Spain on the agenda. What happens is the president says, okay, now we're going to take stock of developments in economic developments in Greece. Yeah? I shall ask the commissioner to kickstart a discussion. So Moscovici speaks on behalf of the Commission, what he thinks has been happening in Greece, what the challenges are, latest discussions with the Greek government, latest economic statistics, and so on. But of course, the finance minister have nothing in front of them, right? Nothing. Zero. Zero. No file, no data, nothing. So Moscovici speaks for about 5-10 minutes. Then the baton is passed to Mario Draghi, who gives his spiel from the perspective of the central bank. Then it's the representative of the IMF, which is astonishing, isn't it? We have the representative of the IMF in our own governance body. Okay. The representative of the IMF speaks, and then Dijsselbloem says, Yanis, your turn, because we're talking about Greece. So I have 10 minutes. And I have to respond to what I heard in there, not to something that I have been briefed about. And often, what you hear is completely unsubstantiated or completely out of the blue. You have no prior warning that these arguments will be made. Yeah? So you have to improvise for 10 minutes. And then the floor is open for other finance ministers to contribute. Usually they are from Eastern Europe, and they are all competing as to who is going to be more likable to Schäuble. To the extent sometimes Wolfgang gets annoyed with them. You're overdoing it, you're overdoing it. Huh? The French finance minister will then speak. Enough said. And that lasts about an hour and a half, usually, sometimes less. And then we can spend up to 6-7 hours debating the communiqué that will come out. That's it. That's a Eurogroup. That is the Eurogroup. Everybody is speaking without having any information, any substance, no substance. So all the decisions have been made before. Don't ask me by whom.
So thank you, Yanis. Thank you, everybody. Don't leave, because now we have to start discussing the communique.
6 hours.
6 hours. No, thank you very much. Thank you very much that you were here.